Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute's virtual event series. To fulfill President Reagan's mission of making the Reagan Library a dynamic intellectual forum, our Center for Public Affairs Programming offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day. Each year, we bring you 20 to 30 events from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. Since the March 2020 closure of many businesses across our great country, the Reagan Foundation is now bringing its events online to ensure that we are still delivering world-class content, even if you can't get to our hilltop to watch it in person. In this week's Center for Public Affairs virtual event, we bring you Jewish dissident Natan Sharansky and American historian Dr. Gil Troy for their brand new book, Never Alone, Prison, Politics, and My People. Natan Sharansky was convicted in 1978 on trumped-up charges of treason and spying for the United States and was sentenced to 13 years in prison. After spending 16 months in Moscow's Lefortovo prison, frequently in solitary confinement and in a special torture cell, Natan Sharansky was transferred to a notorious prison camp in the Siberian Gulag. During the years of his imprisonment, Sharansky became a symbol for human rights in general and Soviet Jewry in particular. Freed in 1986 as part of an East-West prisoner exchange orchestrated by President Ronald Reagan, Mr. Sharansky moved to Israel and dedicated his life to helping immigrants' professional, economic, and social acculturation. He went on to serve as Minister of Industry and Trade, Minister of Interior and Deputy Prime Minister. He received the Congressional Gold Medal in 1986 and the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2006. In 2005, he was listed as number 11 on Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the Scientists and Thinkers category. In 2008, the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute awarded him the Ronald Reagan Freedom Award. Announcing the award, Mrs. Reagan said, "It is an honor to present the Freedom Award to Natan Sharansky. My husband often said that his devotion to the cause of freedom was a symbol of man's highest aspiration, and his release from the Gulag was one of the most rewarding events of Ronnie's presidency." Natan Sharansky joins us in conversation today to discuss his new book, which is co-written by Gil Troy, an award-winning American presidential historian and a leading Zionist activist, who was recently named as one of the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life. During today's virtual conversation, they discuss their book, Never Alone, which is a classic account of courage, integrity, and most of all, belonging. The book reveals how Natan Sharansky's years in prison prepared him for a very public life after his release. As an Israeli politician and the head of the Jewish Agency, Sharansky brought extraordinary moral clarity and uncompromising, often uncomfortable honesty. His story is suffused with reflections from his time as a political prisoner, from his seat at the table as history unfolded in Israel and the Middle East, and from his passionate efforts to unite the Jewish people. We now invite you to enjoy our virtual program, coming to you from the Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., with Natan Sharansky and Gil Troy, and Reagan Institute Director Roger Zakheim.
Natan Sharansky and Gil Troy, thank you so much for joining this show. Welcome to Reaganism.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Natan and Gil, of course, you have just recently published this fantastic book, Never Alone, which goes through prison politics of my people, telling a memoir of your life, Natan Sharansky, from your time in the Soviet Gulag, in Israeli politics, and then leading Israel's Jewish Agency. A great read. Today, I would love to just focus on perhaps the first part of this memoir and really delve into what seems to me a remarkable relationship between you and President Reagan. And I want to start by jumping into something that doesn't reside in your book, Natan and Gil, but it actually is in President Reagan's book. And now I'm talking about his diary. And what struck me when I went into his diary was how many times, Natan, you are mentioned, and how many times over the course of his presidency, from 1981 to 1989, you are mentioned. And the first time you come up is in April, just months after he takes office, April 1981. And he writes what I think is his first letter to Secretary Brezhnev. And what he writes in that letter, the handwritten portion of the letter, not the part that the State Department wrote for him, it's all about you. Are you aware of this letter?
Well, thanks to Reagan's library, I received a few years ago this diary, and that's how I found out about it. And I also found out president's emotional reaction on his meetings with my wife. So of course I didn't know in real time, nothing. I had no idea that my wife became friend of President Reagan. But when we heard in Soviet prison from the Soviet newspaper that President Reagan called Soviet Union evil empire, that was the best day for us in prison, because we knew that finally there is a leader who understood the real nature of Soviet Union. And we were absolutely sure, dissidents, that the moment the West, the free world, will treat Soviet Union as it is, evil empire, it is doomed.
And we'll get to that moment when you were in the Gulag and you found out from Pravda about President Reagan's speech. But going back to 1981, and Gil, maybe as an historian, you could comment on this as well, a counterfactual. President Reagan wrote, handwritten to Brezhnev, if you could find it in your heart to do this matter, that is to release you, Natan, it would be strictly between us, which is why I'm writing this letter by hand. What would have happened if Brezhnev would have responded and said, you know what, I'm going to do a good one for this new president. I'm going to release Natan Sharansky. How would this story have changed, Gil?
You know, on one level, it would have changed. On another level, it wouldn't have changed. Obviously, Natan's story would have changed. And we'll let Natan answer that part, because it would have been very important for Natan that it come with no conditions, because the Soviets were always trying to put conditions on any kind of release in order to make them look good. And Natan's remarkable refusal to play into that game and to betray his fellow dissidents and prisoners really of the future is one of the central themes of the first part of the book. But Brezhnev wasn't willing to give away the story. He wasn't willing to give up on communism. And I think what's really interesting about that letter at the start is that, you know, Reagan on the one hand is asking, on the other hand, he's challenging. And, you know, I was right at the time at Harvard in the history department. I always emphasize the difference between Natan's 1980s, spent mostly in the Gulag, and my 1980s, spent mostly at Harvard. And everyone knew that Ronald Reagan was a dummy. Everyone knew that Ronald Reagan was ineffectual. And when you start reading Reagan's diaries and Reagan's letters like this, you see how clever he was. You see how, and he frankly said he enjoyed being underestimated by the Northeastern elites. And this is actually one more of his traps to kind of pull out from Brezhnev the unwillingness to do that and show the difference, because on the one hand, he truly believed in a sense of common humanity. And on the other hand, he knew that the communists were overriding those instincts and were not about to give up on this or on their broader attempt to not only dominate the world, but to oppress as many people as they could in their supposed march toward equality.
Natan, a few weeks later after that, the president writes in his diary that he met with your wife. She made such a huge impression on him and, of course, the world. You also, at some point, interacted with Nancy Reagan when you were awarded the Reagan Freedom Award years later, I believe in 2008. In your interaction with Nancy Reagan, did she share anything with you about her role and President Reagan's role during these years when he was fighting on your behalf and your freedom?
Well, Nancy treated Avital like President Reagan also, like, I wouldn't say parents, more like grandparents. They were so sentimental on one hand, and on the other hand, they were so firm in their determination to help. And it can be seen in this diary. By the way, in our book, we are publishing some pictures, and one of the pictures is exactly from that meeting of President Reagan with Avital. And why I chose this picture and not the other more famous pictures, because you can see how he's almost hypnotized. He's so impressed by personal story. But the greatness of Reagan was that through these personal stories, he could see the truth, the real drama, the real confrontation between the free people and the evil empire and dictators. And well, I have a lot of stories. In fact, my first meeting with President Reagan, when finally I'm released, when I come first time to America to say thank you to Jews of America, to American people, to congressmen, and of course to President Reagan. And I meet him, and he tells me a joke about Kosygin and Brezhnev, how Kosygin and Brezhnev are sitting and discussing maybe we should open the gates of the Soviet Union because the pressure is very bad. And then Brezhnev says, no, if you open the gates, then everybody will leave, only two of us will stay. And then Kosygin says to me, speak for yourself. And I also laugh, but I think, my God, it's old dissident anecdote from the Soviet Union of 15 years ago. I came to the leader of the free world to see these old jokes. 15 minutes later, I already understood. That is the way how President Reagan gets the most sophisticated and important things about Soviet Union. This double thing, that everybody is lying publicly and thinking differently. And through jokes, and he seemed like such a superficial man who sees the world through jokes. He saw the deep truth. And that's, I felt always in his relations to me personally and to my wife, that on one hand, for him, it's personal drama, and he was very proud. As a proud grandfather, he looked at me and Avital that we did it. On the other hand, for him, it was confrontation with the world of evil, and he was determined to bring it down.
So I want to talk about Doublethink in a minute, because it obviously was a very important part of your time as a political prisoner, and then your work as a political leader and a human rights advocate. We'll get there in a minute. But one of the things you just hit on is what struck me when I read your story. And I've read your story a few different times at different moments in my life. But what struck me now in reading this in 2020 is here you have two global superpowers competing and challenging each other for decades. Brink of nuclear war. Yet this one man, this one individual sitting in a gulag with a young wife who's going around the world, breaking against the rules of the establishment, talking to senators, you as a refusenik, talking to journalists, somehow capture the imagination of everybody and become the thorn in the side of this empire. And the whole conflict, in many respects, comes down to you. It's driving the first letter that the President of the United States writes by hand to his adversary. How does one person make such an impact? That's question one. And question two, is it the personal story that is the true way to challenge those who deny freedom, to challenge dictators? Is that the lesson of your story?
I leave to historians like Gil to speak about how it happened that we had such an influence. But when people ask me how it became that you became such an important prisoner, I always say there are two factors. One is KGB and another Italy. KGB understanding in some moment that this movement of the struggle of Soviet Jews becomes a major danger for them. And they decided to destroy it. And for this, they take the spokesman. At that moment, I was like an official spokesman, and accuse him in espionage of the United States of America. What could bewilder more United States of America? I really was almost every day meeting with American journalists and with those senators who were coming. And and telling them the truth. And now they don't say that was espionage for the United States of America. So KGB really did a lot to attract attention to this. And then KGB underestimated, they thought why they chose me among the other activists, and we had outstanding activists. Because they thought, well, I am young, I am not so known, I have a young wife in Israel, so that will be pressing me. And in the meantime, they can easily break me and my wife. And what they didn't realize that my wife, which they thought will be the factor which will help them, turned into the factor which turned all this case upside down. But I have to say, the thing is that we dissidents, and I was one of them, we always believed and we saw and we understood that this huge empire, with all these missiles, conquering 1/3 of the world, with these parades of the victory, they're extremely weak from inside because they have to spend all their energy to control the brains and lives of 200 million people. And our problem was always that the West doesn't understand how weak they are. And the West is treating them as if they are forever. That's the superpower which they have to treat respectfully and not challenge it. Yet, and yes, when we, a group of dissidents and refuseniks, challenged it, the most important thing was whether the free world will support us. And Jewish people, of course, supported our struggle. Carter was speaking about human rights as an important issue, and we were grateful to him that he brought it to the agenda, but he was never really putting his muscles of the empire, of America behind it. The one who really understood that not only it is important, but that's essential to make a direct linkage between human rights, between personal stories, between personal suffering of the people, and our international policy in the relations with the Soviet Union, that was President Reagan. So with all the credit which goes to me and my wife, it is President Reagan who defeated Soviet Union.
Well, you know, you make, oh, go ahead, Gil.
If I can plunge in, first of all, I was one of those people. From the outside, the Soviet Union looked like it was going to be, it was as strong and as stable as the United States. In fact, in the 1970s, it looked like the Soviet Union was on the way up and America was on the way down. And one of the first conversations Natan and I had about this was realizing that from within, he saw the weakness. And I was one of those people who marched and had the twinning bracelet, and even went in 1985 in the middle of my graduate exams, which is a whole other story, to visit the Soviet Union and visit refuseniks. But I never believed it would really help. I was doing it because I was a nice guy. I was doing it because it was my civic responsibility. So I think that they had that understanding of it was like this big giant, but that was allergic to the little beasting of the dissidents. And two other things, if I may add. One is that one of the things that also blew me away when we started researching this was at no point were there more than 150 refuseniks willing to sign a petition, willing to really go out there, willing to be activists. So Natan was one of a very small group of people who was willing to do that. And think, it gets to the core of your question. 150 people were able to shake up the evil empire, aided, of course, by the president and millions of people around the world. And the other thing I think that Natan brought to the table was that he was the spokesman, it was informal, both for the refusenik movement, for the Jews who were asking to and then demanding to emigrate. And there were thousands who applied, but again, only 150 at any given time were really activists. But he also was a bridge to the human rights movement. He was also a bridge to the dissident movement. He was also a bridge to Andrei Sakharov. And people would say, well, you have to choose. You're either a proud nationalist or you're a human rights universalist. And he said, no, no. And that's part of the message of the book, that we live in an age these days of false choices. And you can be a proud, lowercase l, liberal, a proud fighter for freedom, and also proud of your identity, a proud nationalist.
A great point. And I want to go back to the tension that we feel today between being an advocate for human rights, but also being a proud nationalist. In your case, Natan, it was proud Jew, a proud Zionist. But let's go back to the early days. Ironically, you became a free person when you recognized you were a victim of doublethink. For our listeners and viewers, tell us what doublethink is, and tell us how you broke out of it and why that ultimately was your greatest strength and the Soviet Union's greatest weakness.
No, the best thing I'll tell you simply, very short story. When I was 5 years old, I'm 5 years old and Stalin dies. And I hope that people still remember who Stalin was. So this great dictator of the Soviet Union dies. I come back from kindergarten and my father whispers in order the neighbors in the communal apartment, 3 families in 1 apartment, will not hear. He says, it's miracle happened, Stalin died, it is very good for Jews because we were in big danger. But remember all your life that we are saved because miracle happened and Stalin died, but don't tell it to anybody. Do what everybody does. And next day I go back to kindergarten and I cry together with all the children about death of a great leader. And we sing songs about the son of all the people, Stalin. And I have no idea how many children are crying, really crying, or how many of them are crying like me because father told us to do it. So that is typical life of the loyal Soviet citizen, which I started at the age of 5. When you're saying what you're supposed to say, you're voting, of course, as everybody does, you're reading books which are permitted, and you know that all this is lie. But the truth is only for your family, for close circle of children. And to think that you can fight against it, it's such an unpleasant situation. You're not thinking because there are no values except of survival. I was deprived full of my identity. Everything Jewish was not permitted in my life. Only when, after 1967, Israel came to our life, when I started reading in the underground about my own history. And I felt myself suddenly that if I want, I can belong to this history, to these Jewish people, to this state. Then suddenly I have strength to get rid of the doublethink, to say publicly, I don't want to live here, and to fight for my freedom, for freedom of other Jews, and then simply for freedom. So only through discovering my identity, I could really get rid of this doublethink. And the moment you start speaking what you really think, you feel such a great relief. Suddenly you understand what it means to be a free person, that until now you were a slave. You was in some prestigious scientific institution, thinking all the time about your career, how not to say something which will upset party leaders. And in fact, you were a slave. Now you lost your job, you lost your position in the society, but you are saying what they are really thinking. So that's from this moment I became a free person. And even in prison, whenever they were proposing me different compromises, or like negotiated with Reagan that if I say this, this, and this, they will release me. I knew that the moment I start making compromises with them, I'll become slave again. I'll go back in this world of doublethink, and they didn't want it. So from that, I discovered what a unique power it is to be a free person.
You know, one of the things about this concept of doublethink, and clearly you broke free, you were on the ivory tower, right? And you said and you wrote that the ivory tower kind of broke when you realized it, and Sakharov was such a big influence. It's easier for one to understand doublethink when you're living in an oppressive regime where they're denying your freedom, as you said, they're denying your identity. But you have written how doublethink is something that even exists in free societies. Later in your career, when you're leading the Jewish Agency, and even when you're a minister in government, you spoke out, you had opportunity to visit campuses, college campuses in the United States. Gil was referencing this before, where you're seeing doublethink today. Tell us about doublethink in free societies and how we battle that.
Yeah, well, that is one of big disappointments and very alarming signs. What I mean, I believed that doublethink is the sign of dictatorial regime. People are afraid to speak the truth because they live in the fear society. And we saw how practically in every dictatorship, if you read the book of any dissident, or the one who was afraid to be dissident, but writes a diary, you can see how people in China and in Arab countries and in Czechoslovakia and Korea and in Soviet Union were living under the same doublethink, fear. And the moment they are not afraid, they cross this line between doublethink and dissent, then revolution happens. So suddenly, I started noticing it like 20 years ago, first about Israel, when you were coming to some universities in America, and there is strong anti-Israeli campaign, and very often turning into anti-Semitic campaign. And of course, there are students who are openly supporting Israel, but some Jewish students, frankly speaking, telling me that because of the fear for their career, because of the fear how one or another professor will react on his public support of Israel, they prefer to be silent. Then it was like first very alarming signs for me. Now, 20 years later, it becomes such a broad phenomenon. I think your Cato Institute in America said that 62% of Americans on the left and on the right prefer not to reveal their political views. That's, for me, it's unbelievable. After all, there is no KGB, there is no Gulag. What maximum what you are risking is that maybe not to be respected by some people in the society to which you belong, but for this you are ready to give up on your right to say what you really think. Of course, Gil has also, as a historian, his own perspective, but we both believe that that's maybe the most alarming thing in the free society. That's the first signs of free society entering the free world.
So before Gil jumps in, you've analyzed the problem, how it's playing out. The solution, based on reading your book and your description of people like Reagan and Sakharov, it requires moral clarity and courage, is what you said. Is that what's needed on campuses? Is that what's needed in the public arena, to people have moral clarity and the courage to speak their mind and share their not only political views, but engage in the public arena beyond that?
Absolutely. It's not only campuses, it's in political life, and with all the complexity of political situation. Remember, the problem is not that different people think differently. That's good. That's the proof of free society of democracy. The problem is when different people prefer not to express publicly and clearly their views, and then they can be checked. Their moral position can be checked only when they're speaking, presenting their views. And when ideologies are replacing the people, when there is kind of cancel culture that if you're not part of my ideology, you don't exist for me, I'm not arguing with you. That's something anti-democratic. That's something deeply anti-democratic. Yes, I believe that moral clarity, meaning that always there must be clear moral position. And Reagan was unbelievably clear, his moral clarity.
Go ahead.
Yes, sorry. No, I said what I really.
One of the things that you're kind of driving towards a little bit when you talk about cancel culture and what feeds it is technology. And I want to get to that in a little bit in terms of how technology today is used to stifle freedom and in what way technology can be used to advance it. Going back to your story, and before you were arrested and put in the gulag for 9 years, you were out there as a spokesman for refuseniks, and as Gil mentioned, also a spokesman for the human rights advocates and movement in the Soviet Union. One of the things that you did, and it seems to have come quite naturally, but it wasn't really told in the book, perhaps it was between the lines, you had this natural ability to work with journalists, develop trusted relationships to tell the story. The free press, another fundamental right for any free society, seemed to be critical for your freedom and the freedom for all refuseniks in the Soviet Union. Talk to me about your view on the free press, and how did you managed to develop this amazing set of relationships that really advanced your cause?
Well, the moment I became a free person, it's natural that you want to communicate with other people who are free to express their views. And for me, meeting with journalists was always like crossing the line, crossing the border, the Soviet Union. The Western journalists lived in so-called ghetto, we call it, three different buildings which were controlled fully by KGB. And each time when you are meeting with them, KGB takes into account later, it was all the accusations. But the moment you cross this border and you're with them, they are free and you're free. And you understand, of course, that they have their own interests, they must have a story. And you understand the society from within and you have access to the things that they don't have. But you also have your own interest. You want that the stories of dissidents will be on the front pages. So it was sometimes almost, I would say, cynical mutual interest. But of course, it was clear at the same time that they believe, as I believe, that the world has to know the truth about this regime. And I have to say that, with all the respect to the modern journalists, the fact that many dissidents in Muslim world, in Korea, in China, and so they are not the front of the New York Times or Washington Post when American top officials are visiting these countries. I think it's a shame. It's a shame for America.
Why is that not happening? I mean, this is where I was going to want to get to at the end, but it seems so critical to the work that Avital was doing, your wife, and that what you were doing before you were in prison was the work of journalists, and it managed to find its way to the front page, the headlines that you mentioned, the stories coming out of Hong Kong, the individual stories, the Natan Sharanskys in Hong Kong, or the Zhejiang province, or North Korea. They don't seem to dominate quite as much. The linkage, which we'll get to in a little bit, that you talk about is so critical, doesn't seem to dominate in 2020 as it might have done in 1985.
I think Gil, as a historian, can explain better. From my point of view, the fact that the leader of the free world was putting it as an important issue in international relations, that automatically was helping to journalists who had a lot of sympathy to these dissidents to put it as front stories. The fact that at least in the last 12 years, human rights is not part of international policy of the United States of America under the last two administrations. I think that's a shame. The fact that President Obama can say engagement with the regime is more important than changing of the regime. Or President Trump can say that Korean people really love their leader. It's simply dismissing fully the fact that here are dictatorships which are keeping minds of people under control, and people want to get rid of this control.
And that actually gets to,
go ahead.
Look what Natan just did. He was extremely subversive. He criticized somebody from the left and from the right. And that's no longer acceptable, especially in Washington, D.C. And look, I'm an American historian. I've written about Reagan. I'm well aware about how partisan things were then. But there also was a certain consensus culture, ABC, NBC, CBS. Obviously, the Reaganites had their critique of the media with a tilt, but it wasn't this same kind of polarization, which partially connects to what you were saying earlier about technology. And think of, again, go to Natan Sharansky as an example. Was he a left-wing image or a right-wing image? The answer is yes, both. And we cannot always look at everything, especially when we look at foreign policy. It used to be that we said that that politics, partisanship stops at the water's edge. But now, Saudi Arabia, the Palestinians, each issue is done through this partisan lens. Anti-Semitism, racism, the fight against bigotry is all seen through this partisan lens, this polarizing lens. And that means that we, first of all, as a society, we can't put our differences aside. We're constantly arguing about everything. And I'm sorry to say that this is a failure of the left and of the right. So I think we have to be wary of the polarization and learn, and this is one of the themes in the last part of the book, about this importance of bridging. And when we look at what's going on in the universities today, Natan talks about falling in love with his identity and with his freedom. Look at the attack. It's not just an attack on freedom, it's also an attack on identity. It's an attack on the freedom to express yourself, to think independently. Look, I love the university. I'm a case of arrested development. I got to college and then graduate school and never left. I love the university as a place of critical thought, of free thinking. And yet we have today the situation what I call the silence of the tenured lambs, where professors with full tenure, especially humanities professors, are afraid of their students, afraid of their colleagues, and afraid to speak. So we talk about cancel culture, and that's a fear and a failing on freedom's side. Look what's happening with identity. First they came for the Jews, and then they came for American, right? So first they canceled Israel and Jewish identity and Jewish history, and now there's an attempt to cancel America, American identity, American history. And so we see the linkage in a different way between the fight for pride, the fight for your identity, and the fight for freedom.
You know, it's a great set of points, Gil. And one of the things that really comes across in this great book, Never Alone, is how much Natan, and this really connects in some respects to what Gil just said, your time as a refusenik and then your time afterwards, leading the freeing the Soviet Jewry movement and advocating human rights for all those in the Soviet Union, and then also in Israeli politics, is that you never allowed yourself to get boxed in. And you spent a lot of your time trying to avoid different establishment institutions, other institutions from, you know, trying to either suppress what you're doing or commandeer what you're doing, just so you maintained almost the freedom which you're describing. You had a great line in another something you wrote or something you had said in terms of when you were freed, you didn't just want to be a hero anymore. You preferred to be a disappointment. Explain that. It's perhaps not intuitive, but I love that insight.
Well, you know, when I was released, so many parties wanted me to join them, and I was warned by everybody that we all love you, but the moment you choose them, you're not popular with us anymore. And it's nice to feel that you're popular among everybody. But then you really cannot do anything. You're simply your symbol. Okay, you can enjoy your symbolism. You want to act, and here finally we succeed to open the gates of the Soviet Union. And I describe in the book how Reagan was our partner until the last days of bringing down the Soviet Union. And then a million Jews came to Israel as their integration to the society, and so on and so on. So you understand that if you want to influence, you have to take positions that some people will not like it. And yes, at the moment I became a politician, at the moment I was speaking without any compromise my views, many people were saying, well, you're such a disappointment. Okay, I accept that I'm disappointed in order to be able to live and to influence and to change the world for the better. And by the way, you said that I didn't let anybody to put me in some box. It didn't help. The moment I spoke against Oslo agreements, I was put into the right-wing Israeli politician. And though all my opposition to so-called peace process of Oslo was that of the peace process which is built on enslaving Palestinians, bringing dictatorship of Yasser Arafat to them. So it was all from my liberal positions. It doesn't matter. Exactly this cancel culture. Or you are voting for immediate peace, and then you are with us, or you are voting against peace, and then you're not one of us. So then you don't care. You have to stick to your principles, to what you believe in the power of freedom, in the power of identity, in the power of these two things going together. And that's what I did.
In American,
I want to go back. Go ahead, Gil, and then I want to go back to 1987. But go ahead, Gil, please.
In American historical terms, I think of this as Natan's George Washington dilemma. And he wouldn't let me use that in the book because it made him sound too grandiose. But George Washington was a national icon and already had his birthday as a national celebration before he became president. So in some ways, he too knew he had nowhere to go but down. And on the other hand, that's a real kind of courage to be willing to leverage the popularity, the fame, we would call now celebrity, into something that can be constructive. And I think one of the themes of the second part of the book is indeed, what's it like being a dissident in politics? And Natan points out that many of his dissident friends didn't do very well in politics. He likes to joke that when you're in prison, life is very simple. All you have to do is say no every day, again and again and again. And especially, so you become an expert in stubbornness. And then especially in politics, you have to be an expert in compromise and how to navigate from a world of stubbornness and simplicity and moral clarity to sometimes the moral position is to make a compromise. It's very, very difficult. And that becomes, I think, one of the poignant parts of poignant themes of the second part of the book.
Yeah, I mean, you come to the Reagan Institute offices when this pandemic ends, and we'll welcome you, Gil, and Natan, and we'll show you around. And just on your point, Gil, one of the pictures we have up prominently displayed is Ronald Reagan shaking Tip O'Neill's hand. And, that was clearly a moment of compromise. Reagan was no Republican in name only, a rhino, yet it was a key part of his presidency. Great point. And we'll get back to Oslo and the case for democracy, particularly in the Middle East. Fascinating piece of your outlook and how you arrived at it. But first, I want to go back to 1987. You are now a free person living in Israel. Your wife, Avital, after advocating for you around the world for years, and you have an opportunity to be free people and enjoy a quiet life. But you don't choose that road. You actually continue to fight on behalf of Soviet Jewry and human rights. And Gorbachev is coming to Washington. And you want to put together a rally of hundreds of thousands of people on behalf of Soviet Jewry, organize the American Jewish community, because in your view, though you couldn't support it with data, there were hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews who were denied the ability to live as Jews and to leave the Soviet Union. And all of the professionals and the political advisors, as I understand it and read in your book, were probably telling you and President Reagan, this is a bad idea. Yet Secretary Shultz, Secretary of State at the time, and President Reagan, after you spoke with him, said something else. Tell me about that moment when you asked the President of the United States, please support 300,000 or so people to come to Washington when you have your first summit celebrating your great accomplishments, negotiating with Secretary Gorbachev.
Well, it was more settled and more simple at the same time. Really, I came almost a year before Gorbachev came to Washington. I said, when there will be first visit, and I'm just out of prison, I'm saying, it is very important that when Gorbachev will come for the first time to Washington, that hundreds of thousands of American Jews will greet him there with a demonstration demanding, let our people go. Because there are hundreds of thousands of people who want to come, leave Soviet Union, and to remind that we are speaking about such a big number, about such an important issue, let's have hundreds of thousands of American Jews. I told him very carefully, Mr. President, soon Gorbachev will come, and I want you to know that many American Jews are thinking to have a demonstration, and I hope that you understand it's not against you. I am very careful in choosing words because I don't want to ask for permission. First of all, even if he'll say no, we will do this demonstration. But second, I really don't know how to, I'm not American Jew, how to introduce. Suddenly he interrupts me and he says, and I said, you understand it's not against you. He interrupts me and says, what? Somebody can think that I am interested in a friendship with Gorbachev when he's keeping his people in prison? Of course you have to do this demonstration. Of course you have to do everything what is needed. You'll do your part and I'll do my part. So then I went to American Jewish leaders and said, you know, President Reagan wants this demonstration. One of these leaders, a very good person, nevertheless went to Schultz and said, do you really want this demonstration? And Schultz told me, not only I wanted Gorbachev, whenever he will look on every screen of TV, he will see only this demonstration. That's what we want.
That's what Secretary Schultz said.
That's the Secretary Schultz. You know, they were such a great couple, the President Reagan and Secretary Schultz. They they didn't even have for a moment hesitation whether it will be good or not good if American Jews will organize such a demonstration. So, and as I thought, the moment we go to the grassroots, everybody wanted this demonstration, and then establishment took the leadership, and it was well organized, 250,000, the biggest demonstration equal to the demonstration of Martin Luther King in those days in Washington. And that was a very powerful message to Gorbachev. President Reagan told him, you see, my people spoke. I cannot not agree with them. And that was, in fact, the last battle for opening the gates.
It was the last battle, and actually it was, I was one of the 250,000 in Washington, D.C. on that day. And I see Gil was there as well. A 10-year-old, I remember having the opportunity to go there. And it's when you kind of march with your feet is when you learn. And it was hugely impactful to think about the plight of Soviet Jews and the plight of all people seeking freedom. And when I think about that story, both reading the book and listening to you tell it now, Natan, just for me, having worked in Washington with political leaders on Capitol Hill, the political victory for President Reagan and Secretary Shultz could have been when you were released. They could have spiked the football, as they say in America, and said, we've done it already. The next political victory was peace with the Soviet Union and having a successful summit with Gorbachev. It's a reasonable argument for a policymaker and a political consultant to make to say, we don't need this. Yet President Reagan and as you just said, Secretary Shultz stayed with the principle. And they stayed with linkage, that always wanting to connect human rights with whatever else was going on with their foreign policy. I'd like to move into linkage for our last remaining 5 or 10 minutes of this discussion. For me, for our listeners, tell us what linkage means and how it was first impacted you when you were sitting in the Gulag, when you read in Pravda that President Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire. How did that impact you as a political prisoner in the Soviet Union?
Well, the dissident is the person who, in the conditions of dictatorship, cross this line between doublethink, in the sense, speaks his mind freely, is not afraid, and of course he's punished for this. But dissident is the one who knows very well what is happening in the brain of the people. He knows that majority of the people are double thinkers, like he was. And when he watches these great demonstrations of power, he understands that it's lie. A friend of mine, Andrei Malrik, in 1969 wrote a book where the Soviet Union will survive until 1984. And of course, he was arrested, he was exiled, then he was killed in some very strange car accident. In 1985, Gorbachev started dismantling Soviet Union exactly in accordance with this received. So dissidents are important for the West because they understand what is happening inside the society. And you can understand, as Sakharov and later Senator Jackson were saying, you cannot rely on the regime more than the regime relies on its own citizens. So looking how Soviet Union deals with dissidents, you can understand first how insecure it is, and the second, what is the real nature of this regime and how it will be repressive, and whether you can trust to the agreements of this or not. That's very important role of dissidents. And our despair was that what we saw so clearly as dissidents, the many leaders of the free world didn't see. Of course, there was great Senator Jackson, by the way, Democrat Senator Jackson, but the one who very early understood how you have to speak with the Soviet Union and linked the freedom of migration with the freedom of trade. But that was like a lonely phenomenon. Nobody really put all the agenda of the relations with the dictatorship in connection with the fate of dissidents. Nobody thought that watching the fate of dissidents, you can understand the nature of your opponent. And Reagan was the one who understood it. And his Evil Empire speech, and you're reading this newspaper Pravda. First of all, if you're in a punishing cell, you cannot read anything. But if you're not in a punishing cell, you can read a Soviet newspaper Pravda, which of course is all lies, but you know how to read. And the moment you read it, that it condemns the Reagan, and you understand that the leader of the free world finally said the truth about this regime. So the first thing which you do, you try to know by Morse to send the message to the people who are in the punishing cell. That's why they cannot read the newspaper. To share this great news, that unbelievable news, that finally the free world starts understanding the nature of the Soviet Union. And we are sure that the moment America will really link its relations, economical, political, all the agreements with the situation of human rights in the Soviet Union doomed. And that's exactly what happened.
And let's point out here, Henry Jackson.
By the way, one more. And when I told to President Reagan about that great day in the prison, so listen to this guy. And after this, his speechwriter, who later became the congressman, told me, "You really saved me, because you know how attacked I was for writing that speech, Evil Empire, for President Reagan, how everybody was condemning him and saying that it was a big provocation and I was guilty. Thanks God you came and explained how great it was." And Reagan was happy as a little boy that he heard how this speech was received in Gulag. Sorry.
I should point out that in my historical world, the dean of American historians at the time, Henry Steele Commager, called that speech the worst speech in American history given by a president. That's the gap between the experience that's going on in the hallowed halls of academia and what's going on in the Soviet Union. But again, to go back to one of the themes of the book, let's point out Henry Jackson, Democrat, Ronald Reagan, Republican, and their ability to be on the same page. Although Henry Jackson made his biggest impact, of course, during the Nixon administration, and Reagan subsequently, is one of the things that's missing today. And I also want to point out that we're not fanatic about linkage, right? We're well aware of the fact that you sometimes have to deal with dictators in this world. We don't say that a democracy can't ever deal with a dictatorship, but it has to do it in a way that preserves its moral clarity, its moral purity, and does it with subtlety and effectiveness, and doesn't fall into becoming a collaborator with a dictator, but cooperates as necessary, but also stands with clear red lines. And of course, there are dictatorships that are worse in the way they treat their citizens and less bad, and you can make those distinctions.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, Gil. I'm glad you raised the limits of linkage in the United States. It's a hot political and policy issue, what the U.S. relationship should be with Saudi Arabia, for example. Israel and the United States have been working closely about building a kind of Sunni kind of coalition of countries. Natan, you've been supportive of the Abraham Accords, the peace between Israel and Bahrain and the United Emirates, of course, brokered by the United States. But those countries, again, those aren't democracies, and certainly they don't provide equal rights and freedom to all those who reside in those lands. That would appear to be some limits, examples of the limitations of linkage that Gil was just referencing. How do you organize that in your mind, Natan?
Okay, look, of course, you have to deal with dictatorships. President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill were allies of Stalin, the worst dictator after Hitler in the 20th century. They were allies to fight Nazi regime. The problem started after this, that Churchill was very aware of the dangers of communism. That's why we understood that we can be allies in some point, but we should in no way be allies of Soviet Union in enslaving the other people. And some other, the West didn't understand it. In the Middle East, look, what is the difference between Oslo Agreement and Abraham Agreement? Oslo Agreement meant that we, Israel, together with America, are taking terrorists from Tunis, bringing them to Palestine, and are saying to Palestinians, that will be your dictator. Our prime minister said it's good for us that he's dictator because
So Yasser Arafat is brought from Tunisia, and he's brought
and he was enthroned to be the leader of Palestinians, and it was said specifically that it is very good that he doesn't have restrictions of democracy. That's what will help him to fight our enemies. That's when I wrote my first article against. Also, I said that we will do everything that he will be a strong dictator, and he as a dictator will do everything that his people will hate us because dictators need external enemy. Now, let's take Abraham Accords. We didn't bring these non-democracies to Bahrain and to Abu Dhabi. It exists. We didn't make agreement that we will make them stronger in controlling their own people. It's between them and their people. But we said, now we'll have a piece of real normalization between our societies. What means that it's from bottom up, that even in Egypt and in Jordan today, still nobody is volunteering, no actor will go to volunteer to go with the concerts to Israel because it's impossible. He'll become the enemy of his people. Here, we have the line of the actors, of the businessmen, of the tourists, of all types of people who want to build these relations. So, in fact, these accords not only help to normalize relations, which is very good, but they also encouraging civil society. In fact, free democratic society of Israel will be cooperating with grassroots in these countries. So it's good for peace and for normalization, but it's also good for at least encouraging civil society. That is the difference. One thing when we are trying to mobilize dictators and to say it's okay, with your people whatever you want, we will help you to control your own people in order you will be our ally. And that's absolutely wrong. It will work against us. I was warning about it many times, and that's exactly what happened. And the other thing is that we are not ready to pay you anything for normalizing relations with us, but we will be very happy to work people to build the real relations.
We only have a minute or so left. I have to get one thing on China, and then we'll go to the lightning round. So much to discuss on China and the latest major great power competition between the United States and a communist country, a country that's not free. Thinking about you and your story made me think about China. And my question to you is when you think about human rights in China and its role and linkage, is the problem that U.S. leadership doesn't talk about the Chinese Natan Sharansky? Or is the problem that we don't know who is the Natan Sharansky in China? That there isn't one quite like you who could lead the discussion from inside China. What's your view?
No, first of all, it's not true. Today, with the internet, there are many names. There are dissidents who are in prison, but there are the whole peoples, like Tibetan, Uyghur, and the other minorities, which go through awful torture and cleansing. But the last American president who was strongly speaking about it was President Bush's son. And whatever is the criticism about other aspects, but he was really good. He personally met with more than 100 democratic dissidents. And I was present and involved in meetings between him and Chinese dissidents. In the last 12 years, I don't think that any name of any Chinese dissident was mentioned in any speech of the prominent leaders of the free world. Why so? When you're coming to China, where are your lists of dissidents which you are bringing to Soviet Union? Where is your indignation about their fate? About indignation, what is happening with the whole cultures which disappear at this moment in China? Gil, you want to add something?
Power, right? We have the power to make those heroes because it's not like Natan Sharansky was a household name in the Soviet Union, right? It wasn't his moral power didn't come from within, right? It came from outsiders saying, hey, wait a minute, this is important. And so it's really a moral responsibility on us to learn more, to identify who those people are and reach out. And I think one of the things you keep on seeing in the Natan Sharansky story is that because there was this network of Jewish people and freedom lovers and people like Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan and George Shultz looking out for him, he didn't disappear into the gulag, right? My son read Fear No Evil and said, why didn't they shoot him? And one of the things we tried to do in the book is explain that the Soviet Union tried to play a particular set of rules because they were trying to kind of convince the world how pure they were. And Natan also points out that they were trying to get trade from the United States. But part of it also was that the outside world was looking on. And that's why Natan knew that even when he was in the gulag for 9 years with very few visitors, he was never alone. And that's why we called the book Never Alone.
Never Alone. All right, well, let's wrap up. Thanks, Gil. Natan, this is our lightning round where we ask either your favorite book about Reagan, your favorite Reagan speech, your favorite Reagan quote. Just give us one or two that's top of mind. Obviously, you've hit on a couple during our conversation.
Reagan's speech, Evil Empire speech. Reagan's quote, Mr. Gorbachev, bring down that wall. Favorite book? Gil Troy wrote books about almost all modern American presidents. One of his books is about Reagan, how it's the morning of America, where he speaks how Reagan simultaneously advanced conservative values and liberal values.
We'll leave it there. Natan Sharansky, Gil Troy, thank you for spending time with us. Excellent book, Never Alone. We look forward to having you back, hopefully in person after this virus leaves us, and we'll welcome you to the Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. A lot of health to everybody.
We hope this conversation has inspired you to share what you've learned with your family and friends, and that you'll join us again for an upcoming event.
And let me offer lesson number one about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do.